L'italianità piace tantissimo.
Io sono italiana e svizzera di passaporti, ho 2 passaporti. Sono ancora italiana? Non so.
Poi cosa è importante? Dove si nasce, dove si sta, dove si muore, dove si viene sepolto. Non lo so.
Sono arrivato a Biel il giorno.
I arrived in Biel in the month of May. I can't recall the exact day, but it was in May 1972, with the usual suitcase, the striped jacket. I had a small room at the time. I went there to sleep. For eating, I went elsewhere, because the room had no kitchen. But we were young, after all. It was okay. Things went well enough in terms of work. I already knew the profession a bit, because I had worked as a house painter since I was 11 in Sicily. I didn't go to school for long. We were like a family. I felt fine. I was earning good money, and I stayed here from 1972 to 1975, I think. Then came the oil crisis. I was a seasonal worker, and the manager called me in and told me, "There's not much work. I can't renew your contract."
Mi ha chiamato il direttore e mi ha detto: "Guarda che abbiamo poco lavoro, non ti posso fare più il contratto." Poi ho avuto la fortuna che c'avevo un amico.
I was lucky. I had a friend in Turin, and I found a job in Turin.
Io, essendo che sono venuto da giovane,
I had come here to Switzerland when I was young. I know Piedmont very well, but I always had the idea of coming back to Switzerland.
Di venire in Svizzera. Scendavamo a Briga.
We would get off at Brig, leaving the train, all the seasonal workers. They made us undress and stand in line to pass the X-rays.
Passare le radiografie. Ti sentivi un po' emarginato.
I felt a bit alienated. You come here to work, and then you are, no, not exactly humiliated, but the things I had to go through to work. I had to undress to pass a checkup.
Devo spogliarmi, devo passare una visita. Stagionale l'ho fatto.
I did seasonal work the first time for 3 years, then again for 2 years. 5 whole years as a seasonal worker. 5 more years on work permit B, and we're up to 10. Then I got the permit C. Having a permit C, and I still have it, I'm not Swiss. It gives you more security. We came here to work, and we worked, without making a fuss about it. But we were aware that we were in a foreign country. You have to settle in. You are a guest here. I experienced a lot of discrimination. I had to be careful. I was a foreigner.
Ero sempre uno straniero, Nel 1964, sì, mia sorella aveva 2 anni.
In 1964, my sister was 2 years old and I was 10, since I was born in 1954. My father and mother were in St. Gallen. There were many textile factories there. Our parents worked. We couldn't go to school because we were in Switzerland illegally. But we wanted to go out. You know how kids are. Then someone betrayed us. One day, the police came. The police said, "Do what you want, but the children have to leave Switzerland within 2 weeks." My father then resigned, and we went back to Sicily. An immigrant? Well, I do live here. In a certain sense, that's what I am. But I don't feel like an immigrant. I feel like an Italian. I'm Italian, though I have spent my life in Switzerland. I am an Italian abroad.
I was born here in Switzerland at Uster when I was 8 years old, and my family decided to return to Italy. So I went to school there and through high school and university in Rome, and then I also worked in Italy. My father had lived for 20 years in Switzerland, 20 years of life abroad, a period when immigration was harder. They definitely felt like foreigners in a foreign country, and they did miss their family. My parents, like almost all the people at the time, built a house in Italy, and the dream was to return to Italy and to live in Italy. I have an older sister, 3 years older than me. She suffered from this move to Italy more than I did. And in our childhood, we always told each other, we will go back to Switzerland. We will go back when we grow up. Now, when I go to Italy, I feel like I'm coming home. I feel Italian. Although I've lived here for a long time and I was born here, I still feel Italian. My husband is Italian. At home we speak Italian and we listen to Italian music. We watch Italian TV, we read Italian newspapers, and I love reading in Italian. Yet, I do not feel like a foreigner here in Switzerland. I have settled in well and I'm well integrated. My job helps me a lot in this sense, because it allows me to be in contact with the Italian language and culture in everyday life. So I always feel a bit like I am in Italy. So my students were almost all born here in Switzerland, just like their parents. They go to school here and they live here and they are fully integrated. They speak Italian at home and probably at different levels. So when I began this teaching job, you could hear the dialects from the regions of origin more strongly, while today there is more of a German influence.
Interferenze dialettali dei paesi di origine. Adesso ci sono più interferenze con la lingua tedesca. Adesso viviamo in...
We now live in a time of which there is definitely no discrimination against Italians, and we are well liked by the Swiss population. The Italianità is very well liked. While we may still be criticised for various aspects of our way of doing things or our culture, I think most people in Switzerland appreciate various factors such as our spontaneity, our light-hearted approach to life, at times not taking ourselves too seriously, being ironic about ourselves. These are all typical aspects of Italian culture that are lacking here in Switzerland. There was actually a period of my life when, together with my husband, we thought about going back to Italy. But then, to be honest, we were stopped by thoughts about the future of the children, because we feel more secure in Switzerland.
Perché ci sentiamo un po' più sicuri qui in Svizzera, in questo senso.
I think about my distant future. My dream is to live in a house with a view of the sea. For me, the sea means inner peace.
My father and mother met in Geneva. They were teenagers, and both of them had roots in Piedmont. On my father's side of the family, the Rossetti came from Monferrato, but I knew little about my grandfather. I only remember that he came to Geneva towards the end of the war of 1914 to 1918. He was passing through. He reached the Caravan station in Geneva, and he saw someone feeding the birds. In Italy, birds were for eating. So if someone was giving bread to the birds, it meant there was enough food to go around. That's why he decided to stay in Geneva. My maternal grandparents were fascist sympathizers. The paternal grandparents were Christian Democrat socialists. They never talked about politics. The suffering had been too great. My father wanted to fit in as fully as possible. He had friends in sports. They went skiing together. His friends were a bit more chic than he was, so they took him along. They went fishing. Every Sunday there were trout for lunch. And we went to the Servette football matches. That's how he integrated.
On avait des truites. Puis surtout, on allait au Servette ensemble au match. Puis ça, c'est un intégrateur.
One particular element of my life, which has always been quite humble, is the fact of living at the junction, a working-class neighbourhood, but Catholic. Therefore, we met more Catholics than Protestants. I didn't know what a Protestant was. We saw only Catholics. I had a very strong bond with my mother, very strong. We went to the opera together. Then, during the war, my mother felt obviously very Italian. She had a bicycle with the Italian flag. We were not allowed to have an Italian flag. So what did my mother do? She put the Neuchâtel flag, because it has three colours, green, white, red, with a small Swiss cross. Being Italian and having tuberculosis, the Association Pro-Tuberculosis would help only Swiss children. My mother was denied the money for my treatment. My mother had to do something that had a high price for her in terms of morale. She went to work as a waitress in a cafe. Someone seeing me from the outside might say, sure, Sandro is a chatterbox. He's an Italian. He talks with his hands. He likes to drink a glass. He likes to tell stories, to play games, to dance. So there is something there. It's hard to talk about yourself, but something inevitably shows through, something inside, and it makes you feel proud.
D'être là-dedans et puis d'en être fier. Peut-être que je suis plus genevois que les Genevois.
Maybe I'm more Genevan than the Genevans themselves, because there was the need to be accepted. I had to try harder than a person who came from here. I had to demonstrate that I was like you, perhaps even better than you. So watch out. If I had had children, I would still have an Italian passport. I don't have kids, so my passport is Swiss. At the age of 20, I received Swiss citizenship, and I could get an education at a low cost. That was why I did it. From 1964 to 1966, I went to Florence whenever I had a chance. The famous flood came in November 1966. My mother encouraged me to take part in the rescue mission, not to rescue people, but to save the culture. There was the National Library with 5 million books. All the cellars were full of water and mud. We spent our days salvaging books. Later, I received a decoration for that work. I went back 5 years ago with a photograph, and the person in charge at the entrance to the National Library told me, "So, you were one of the 6,000 helpers." I already have a list of 4,000. I'll add your name. With a rubber stamp, I was listed as a mud angel. Can you believe it? A mud angel. Heaven and earth. What better reward could you have in your life than to be a mud angel?
Comme récompense dans la vie d'être un ange de la boue.
On the one hand, like many people in Valposciavo, we had economic relations with the Valtellina. My father had vineyards there, and so the border, in this sense, was always open. On the other, there is the nearby Bernina Pass, which can get closed in the winter, and is a linguistic borderline as well. So there is this sensation of being in this valley that is ours alone, where to the south they speak Italian, but they are not Swiss, and to the north they are Swiss, but do not speak Italian. In the Grissons, we might say that there is a certain xenophobia that runs from north to south, with rankings of superiority from German to Romansh to Italian. Moreover, as we know, the Italian community of seasonal workers was the largest presence of foreigners in Switzerland in the 1950s and 1960s, which also led to the Schwarzenbach initiatives. So for us, but also for the people of Ticino, Italian felt as a socially inferior language. Often, to be provocative, I say that my language is Italian, but my culture is Swiss. I believe I have much more in common with someone from Zurich than with my own cousins who grew up 5 kilometers away on the other side of the border. I left my compulsory schooling in Posciavo one Saturday at 11 a.m. and I began middle school at Zuotz in German on Monday at 7:45 a.m. It was traumatic, I must say. If a person from Posciavo scores 5.5 on a German exam, a German would get at least a 7. It can only be like that because everything we have to do is much more laborious. And we have to try to be much better than our competitors just to reach the same level. In the cantonal administration of the Grissons, you have to speak German. Therefore, the discrimination is much more subtle. The attachment is total, powerful, inalienable, and I've always said that I will live and die as a Bündner who speaks Italian. It is something you cannot take away from my identity. It is real, and I have learned to celebrate it to some extent. For example, as president of the Swiss Historical Society, I speak lots of Italian. It is symbolic, but extremely important. Normally, in Switzerland, people automatically think I am from Ticino. When I say that is not the case, then for them, I am automatically Italian. This more or less sums up our problem of always having to explain our identity and our background. I bought my military service papers because they bear the inscription Libretto di Servizio in Italian. This is the embodiment of being Swiss and of being a Swiss person who speaks Italian. If we look at the page of equipment issued in 1987, I have a grey identity card, which is in German. The recognition mark in German, the recruitment gear in French. Then, at the end, we find the only thing that is in Italian, written by hand, listing 2 short-sleeve shirts. And that about sums it up. Since 1848, Italian has been an official national language, but in practice, things here work either in German or in French.
O in tedesco o in francese.
I was born in Trapeto, a small town in the province of Palermo by the sea. A beautiful place, really charming. My mother had 5 children and we were almost penniless. My father was a fisherman. We survived by eating the fish he couldn't sell, practically our only food. Then he changed his job. He began working on big ships, on oil tankers, so he would be away from home for a year, even 2 years at a time.
Era imbarcato sulle navi, sulle petroliere, e stava via 1 anno, 2 anni. All'età di 7 anni.
At the age of 7, I emigrated to Lombardy, so to speak, because in those days the people who headed north were considered immigrants, known as terroni. For me, that really felt as a migration. People in the north didn't like southerners very much. There were even signs inscribed on the buildings, "We don't rent to southerners."
Pensa che c'erano anche dei cartelli dove c'era scritto "non si affitta ai meridionali". Il mio papà aveva trovato lavoro all'azienda.
My father worked for the municipal gas utility doing excavation. I grew up in Como. I went to school there until the 3rd year of middle school. Then I took evening classes. I did office work, 2 years of bookkeeping, and then I went to work in Switzerland as a border worker. I had found a job in Italy, but the pay was very low, and Switzerland was our little American dream. After a while, I met a man there, who is now my husband.
La nostra piccola America. E lì, dopo qualche tempo, ho conosciuto il mio attuale marito.
When I went to work in Switzerland, we were almost all Italians. It was a small electrical parts firm. Only our boss was Swiss.
Dove solo il nostro capo era uno svizzero. Che mi ha colpito è stato il fatto che
I was struck by the fact that they did medical checkups to see if you had any ailments. Though that didn't upset me, I didn't really understand it.
Mi ha non scosso, ma ho detto ma non capisco, non mi sono mai sentita una...
I've never felt like a migrant because I didn't come to Switzerland with a cardboard suitcase looking for employment. When I moved to Switzerland, it was because I got married.
Avevo un bisogno spasmodico di lavorare e poi sono venuta in Svizzera perché mi sono sposata. Da Stabio, dove ci siamo sposati.
From Stabio, where we were married, we migrated, again, so to speak, to Aiorolo, where we lived for 25 years. I cried a lot when I left Switzerland. I had to leave a lot behind me. I can't really say what I miss about it, because in any case, I do go back. I go there often to visit our children who live there, or just for a day trip. So I don't really miss it. It's still close by.
E quindi non mi manca perché ce l'ho vicina, capito?
Italy and Switzerland are my homelands. That's it. The story begins in Naples, where I worked as a babysitter for an aristocratic family. I looked after a 4-year-old girl. I had only had compulsory schooling, and in Naples there was a very high social class, meaning nobles, aristocrats, and then ordinary people. Being a servant was considered low status, and that made me feel humiliated.
E questo mi sentivo umiliata. E quindi
So I decided to leave Naples because I thought that by coming to Switzerland I could enter another social status, not that of a servant in a household. Since my sister was already here, I decided to take a train from the south and go to Switzerland.
Decisi di prendere il treno del sud e di venire in Svizzera.
I arrived in Switzerland, convinced it was a good move. What I found was a bit different from what I expected, though. Heavy labour, working shifts. A young woman has the strength for this, but for me it was hard going from an aristocratic, affluent family to working shifts. I had to wake up at 3 in the morning to go to the factory. I worked in a plastics factory, making knobs for cookware. Switzerland selected only the best, and the country was able to count on having the best. The young people, a labour force. That is what we were, basically. In the house where I lived, a house where rooms were rented out, I met my husband. We liked being here. We had 2 paychecks. You could live in a dignified way. So the idea of returning to Italy began to fade, and we no longer thought about it. In the meantime, I had changed factory, working shifts again, to be close to home and care for my son. One of our neighbours had a boy of the same age, and she did afternoons, and I did mornings, so we could look after the children. What happened later, with the Schwarzenbach period, was very alarming, and we were worried. We decided our son should begin to attend Italian schools. We didn't want to be here anymore. I began to feel uncomfortable. Rapperswil had always been a very welcoming city, but there was this atmosphere in the air. You didn't feel welcome, you didn't feel at home. You were there, but you weren't wanted. I stopped working. I had prepared everything for our departure to Italy. Daniela was born on the 2nd of December with a serious disability, and the world came crashing down on us. Here, my daughter had the best medical treatment possible, and we have had a dignified life. This is the great debt of gratitude I have for this country. We gave up our Italian passports and took Swiss ones. It was very painful, very distressing. For me, it was an enormous insult to my Italian identity. But then years later, the possibility arose to reclaim Italian citizenship, and now we have dual passports. After our children left home, I said to myself that the moment had come to give back what I had received. I've always said that love is a wave that goes and returns, and that love should not die with you. If you leave it to yourself, it dies. So I began to be active with the Citizens Committee. I was the secretary, then the vice president, and we did many things. Also on the Parents' Committee, I was involved with the Italian school. I love Switzerland deeply. It's my home. I could never go back. And then I'd be creating the same void I left behind me. I couldn't do that. My children are here. I am Swiss.
I was born in Sion. I'm 85 years old now. I worked in the construction business for my whole life, and now I'm happily retired. I'm a thoroughbred Italian. My parents are 100% Italian on both sides of the family. I belong to the fourth generation. My family came from a village called Sostegno, which is now located in the province of Biel in Italy, in the countryside. My ancestors left Italy in about 1880. They left Italy, like so many others, because a person has to eat. Some were plasterers or worked in a lime works. That enabled them to come here with something like a profession. I've often asked myself this, but I've never felt I was being treated as an Italian, I must say. My father was very well inserted here in Biel. He was born here. I don't think any of his friends felt like they were particularly Italian, and he too was really well inserted. I have never had the sensation of being seen as a macaroni or a magout, as they said back then. This Italian past tends to fade generation after generation because there is a mixture of cultures. I had the good fortune of having a wife who had an affinity for everything Italian, but then that fades, given the fact that my children have married Swiss people, and one of my daughters lives in the German part of Switzerland. My father always taught me to respect the workers, the Italian workers who came to us here and found a warm welcome. My father was aware of the fact that they were countrymen. Is it thanks to the Italians that the situation has changed? It did not get any worse, I can say that. I don't have the sensation that they have brought something to the Valais. It's true, all these Italians who've come here. But I can't say this has radically changed things. After the Italians, there were quite a few other waves of immigration. The Spanish, the Portuguese, who came a bit after, adding themselves to the mixture. I believe the Italians have fitted in well, living normal lives. I no longer hear anyone say, that guy's Italian. Things I miss? The Italian environment. Sostegno is located about 200 kilometers from Biel. And of course, it is a completely different life. When I'm down there, after a while, I miss the Valais. And when I'm here, I want to go down to Sostegno, because I miss the atmosphere there. Sometimes I feel like an Italian in Switzerland, and sometimes like a Swiss person in Italy.
I was born and raised in Somalia. I always lived in Mogadishu, where I went to school with my brothers and sisters. Somalia was an Italian colony, and this is why, since the Somali language was not written, I know Italian in some way better than Somali. At school, the program was in Italian. I learned more about Italy, and because Somali was not a written language, no one taught us the history or geography of Somalia. Instead, I learned about Italian geography, and history, and especially Italian literature. I liked the literature, the poems, very much. There was an Italian association. We also joined. So it was not, well, yes, it was colonial, but that did not seem like a burden. There was just one small rule. When we got to school, once inside the gate, everyone had to speak Italian.
C'era l'obbligo di parlare l'italiano. C'era la dittatura, ecco, non si poteva.
There was a dictatorship. You couldn't travel, you couldn't leave. But I was lucky to get to know an Italian woman who worked at the consulate, and she was going to Italy.
Che andava proprio in Italia.
So I was able to go to Italy, and since she afterwards went to Switzerland, I came here too. Back then I didn't even know where Switzerland was.
Per caso, ecco, come l'italiano per caso mi è capitato.
It was by chance, like learning Italian by chance. I also ended up in Switzerland by chance.
Piccoli io ho parlato l'italiano.
I spoke Italian with my children ever since they were small, because Somali brought back sad feelings. It made me think about the war, about the loss of my parents, about how my mother got herself killed. For me, holding a baby in my arms and speaking Somali, it was simply too much. So my first impulse was to speak Italian. This language is a language of my heart, of my childhood, of my culture, because my cultural background is also Italian. I like the music of the Italian Renaissance, and I take guitar courses at the Conservatoire of Fribourg. At times I also ask myself, what do I do? Do I think in Italian? Do I dream in Italian? I can't really say. Actually, I feel more like a citizen of the world. I have Italian in my heart. But also my Somali, my African tradition. But I have a strong bond with Italy. My brother lives in Italy. I go there often. I have Italian friends.
Vado spesso in Italia, ho degli amici italiani all'università Fribourg.
At the university in Fribourg, I have been with many people from Ticino, with whom I spoke Italian, and they're still my friends today. I also feel Swiss because I live here. My children were born here, and I have lived for a longer time in Switzerland than in my native country. When I'm feeling rather lost, I say to myself, my roots are here. So for me, it is a kind of wealth, an asset.
Mio padre era calabrese.
My father was from Calabria, and he came here to work. There was an opportunity. He was a nurse in the Gotthard Road Tunnel. Then he drove ambulances. My mother also came here when they got married. When they first arrived, my father was 18 years old, my mother 16. So they too have been here for a lifetime.
Mia madre ha 16, quindi sono qua da una vita anche loro. Tra di noi non c'è mai stato questo peso.
In our family, there was never this emphasis on the fact that we're foreigners, at least not for us kids. They may have talked about it with each other, but they never made it a burden for us. The thing was seldom discussed. It was all very natural. In the end, I think my parents have adapted very well. So for them too, it was very natural.
Vivevano nella normalità anche loro. Non posso dire di aver subito.
I wouldn't say that I've come across particularly strong forms of racism, no.
Sì, certo.
Yes, of course, we were always told to behave, because in any case, you're a foreigner. That is true. In the end, I grew up here. All my friends are here. My life is here. People have told me that in terms of character, I am more Swiss than certain Swiss. I'm very polite. I don't want to disturb too much, while Italians might have this reputation for being a little more... Well, I obviously say I come from Switzerland, but then everyone asks, but you're not Swiss, are you? Due to my dark complexion, dark hair, dark eyes. I can't fool anybody.
Quindi non inganno mai nessuno. È bello anche pensare che la gente mi vede come...
It's fun to think that people often see me differently. They often say I look Turkish. I've travelled. I've been in Armenia, and they thought I must be Armenian. In Jordan, they called me a Bedouin. I think it's fun. I've realised that I no longer have particular ties to Italy, if not for vacations or visits. I enjoy going to Italy and seeing the country. I like the art you can see here in Italy, very much. But in personal terms, we have no one there. We no longer have this bond. We don't have houses in Italy. In the end, our life is here. Even my mother, my parents, they would have never gone back to Italy.
Anche mia madre, mio padre e mia madre non sarebbero mai tornati in Italia. Per certe cose sento che non mi appartiene più.
In some ways, I feel like it no longer is a part of me. There are certain things I don't like. I say that reluctantly because, after all, it is my country of origin. We always went to the countryside near Salerno to see my maternal grandparents. We went there every year on vacation. I have an Italian passport, yes, and I'm applying for citizenship to have a Swiss passport. I'm still waiting. We'll see. When I was young, I never thought about it. But in the end, I was born and raised here. My father is buried here. My mother needed serious health care. All these things made me understand, in the end, I'm from here. What is important after all? Where you're born? Where you live? Where you die? Where you're buried? I don't know. I travel a lot too, and I realize that when I return to Airolo, I feel at home. That is, I feel good here. It's a point of departure and an arrival point.
È un punto di partenza, un punto di arrivo.
I came to Zurich when I was 20 years old, and almost immediately I took part in a meeting of the Colonia Libera Italiana of Zurich. I was fascinated by the spontaneous discussions and the sense of freedom in the air. It was not a political party, but an association, and that was the beginning of my social activism in the context of the Colonie Libere, lasting about 20 years.
Sociopolitiche all'interno delle colonie libere che sono durate circa 20 anni. La donna,
women, if they worked, had 3 jobs: the family, the husband, good or bad, and then the factory, or whatever their employment was. This was one of the many injustices. The injustices were hard, very harsh working conditions, and lower pay than what was offered to men. The children were often placed in special classes, of which there were 4 types. Not because they weren't bright enough, but because they didn't speak the language or spoke it badly. This factor was interpreted as a lack of intelligence, and I felt this was terribly unfair. And it happened to the first of my 2 children. Some of us, myself included, got involved in school groups and parents' associations. We thought we could make things become more down to earth, more concrete. And in fact, that was what was happening. The work with these groups of parents was useful, and it raised awareness of the fact that education should be for everyone. That linguistic differences are not fundamental, not even social differences. I came from a social background that was not low, we might say, so I already spoke French. When I arrived here, I spoke French, and everyone accepted that. Everyone spoke it in those days. So I had an advantage. Basically, I was privileged, and I had therefore the possibility of helping with the problems of the others. Swiss industry definitely called in too many workers, that's true, without providing facilities for them. They had to live in shacks, as we know. But if by chance they had an apartment, they could not bring their families here. An absolutely indecent situation. It still makes me angry when I tell you these things. There was an unbearable atmosphere in certain circles with which I had contact. It was inhuman, disgusting things.
Era una cosa disumana, schifosa, secondo me.
This is what I recall of the Schwarzenbach initiative, which was rejected. But there were many of them. In the end, the Italians have reached the top, the crème de la crème, because they're good at what they do. They're likeable, they're good cooks, they are open and speak a language that can be more or less understood. Given the fact that I do not speak Swiss German, I'm not well integrated, that's clear. I'm integrated to some extent, but critical. I try to do the things I can, the things I have wanted to do. But I should also say that I like Zurich very much. I love the films, the cinemas, there's great literary and linguistic freedom, also in terms of lifestyle. Perhaps even too much freedom, I would say. I am Italian and Swiss in terms of papers. I have 2 passports, but I don't know if I feel Swiss, though maybe I no longer feel Italian either, because after 50 years, am I still Italian? I don't know.